Welcome to this webinar on resilience and vulnerability in leaders. I'm Nisa Cheddakarsan, and your main presenters today are Rachel, Arkle and Simon North. We are really delighted to have Rachel with us today. She is the Managing Director of Yoke Consultancy, which specialises in driving change through well-being. Rachel has over 12 years experience in management consultancy, has a master's in organisational well-being. This puts her in a unique position to offer real insight into our topic today. Simon is the founder of Position Ignition and has been in many leadership roles throughout his career. He has worked across a number of different organisations, including Rolls-Royce, Shell, PwC, KPMG and IBM, to name a few. He is an expert in the world of work and will be sharing his thoughts with you today.
We're going to cover the concepts of resilience and vulnerability and how they play out in your real working world. From my perspective, resilience is a fascinating term that is very prevalent in everything I come across well-being related. So just to set the landscape, I'm going to define both of the concepts, starting with resilience. So the standard definition is your ability to properly adapt to stress and adversity. A colloquial term, some people refer to bouncing back, or your ability to be knocked down by life and then to come back even stronger. Academia actually follows a very similar definition, but they often apply it either generally across your life or to four particular areas known as the 4 C's: confidence, control, composure, and commitment. On the opposite end of the spectrum comes vulnerability, which is actually defined as your inability to withstand the effects of a hostile environment. Or, I guess, your susceptibility to physical or emotional or another form of injury. Although these terms have been around for a while, the reason that Simon and I are so interested in them is because we feel that they're evolving and growing into very different concepts, in particular in the workplace today. So, there's 3 aspects of this session that we'd like to focus on. Firstly, how resilience and indeed vulnerability play out for you as an individual. What is your daily experience of being resilient and of being vulnerable? The second aspect is then how do we bring this to life to the business context? And as we all know, our behaviours and habits can often be very different, but we want to understand why this changes and ultimately how this, in particular for leaders, is going to project in the future. And then thirdly, we want to help you have a few takeaways, practical tips, and actually personal and also academic case studies that will help you integrate a more balanced view of resilience and vulnerability into your daily life.
These are really significant themes in the world of work, and we've been interested in the juxtaposition between them and particularly the tension that exists between these both. And I want to talk first of all about resilience for a bit, because there's this sense in which today we must be resilient. It's almost like a badge that is laid on us. Woe betide us if we show ourselves not to be, almost. So we're saying that all the evidence is, from our organisational know-how and what we read, that resilience is a given, and the flip side of it, or the opposite end of that spectrum, is weakness. And there's a sense in which, just like this runner, we have to keep on going. You sometimes hear this metaphor of, am I a sprinter or am I a marathon person? You've got to be a marathon person. You've just got to keep on going, not just for the 26 odd miles, but beyond it. We must stay fit. There's no room for being exhausted and tired. And how dare you yawn in a meeting, all of that. So I am resilient because I am strong. If I am resilient, I am also able to stand up and perform day in, day out. I can be independent. And the assumptions that we make or are made about us as individuals are that we are able to look after ourselves and that the organization has an expectation that we will, and we will keep on turning up. And if we're not, we get a black mark. From an organization point of view, we assume that they're going to support us and that we have that sort of expectation, whether that is true or not. And these issues of resilience and vulnerability, the reason we're bringing this webinar today is because we believe that the view that an individual takes and the view that an organization takes is changing, is needing to change, because the world of work has been changing and is changing at such a pace. We wanted a site what is a wonderful film, Apollo 13, and a terrific book by Gene Kranz. If you haven't heard of the book, it's called Failure is Not an Option. And rather amusingly, some years ago, probably 12, 13 years ago, when I joined a management team, the chief executive bought a copy of this book and gave it to everybody in the team. And it was almost like, read this because this is what it's all about. There's no way that we can fail here. We were actually trying to rescue quite a significant business that was in a lot of trouble across many different international boundaries. But from the CEO's point of view, failure was not an option. And he was citing the fantastic achievement of a spacecraft that was sent to be, I think, the third landing on the moon, and it didn't actually make it. The 3 astronauts did make it back, but there was that lovely phrase that you probably heard of where it said, Houston, we have a problem. And you only have a problem, and you let Houston know and use those words when things are pretty dire. And the story of the book is how these astronauts were brought back. And you can imagine that only a matter of a couple of days since it was launched, this was big bananas, live TV and so on, the world is watching you, the astronauts are in everybody's mind, everybody that's got a TV, that we were watching NASA's competence, we were watching indeed the competence of the United States of America that was the most dominant nation on Earth. It was about pride, and it was about all of the details that had to be put in place to enable failure not to be an option.
I guess from that point, it's a very fascinating topic that mindfulness is a very personal area of interest of mine, but overlaying mindfulness into this new context of resilience has been very fundamental as to how I see myself. So I thought I'd just start by explaining a little bit about the core of mindfulness. And it's sort of represented by this very simple V shape of reality and non-reality. So the Buddha really only talked about 2 things. In his terms, it was dukkha and non-dukkha, but as this diagram reflects, on the left, reality, and on the right, non-reality. So slowly in life, we build a self-perception of ourselves. And typically, if we're in this resilience mindset that Simon has just reflected on, we can gain momentum and gain a cycle where we're constantly pushing ourselves to stretch and even into stress mode and exacerbating our non-reality or perception expectations of ourselves. This, as many of us know, can be very positive because it ultimately makes us move forward. But unless it's done with a very mindful reality that we're also human and susceptible to elements of failure or vulnerability, whether it be a simple headache or even potential risk of burnout, we begin to create a very broad yellow V. So the more heightened expectations or non-reality we create for ourselves, further away from the actual humanistic reality we are. And therefore we create a very big space in between or gap, which ultimately is what the Buddha calls suffering. The bigger the gap between your reality and non-reality, the greater potential for downfall. And this is an incredibly interesting idea, because if we begin to reflect more, to understand ourselves, maybe with mindfulness, or maybe at least with that thread of vulnerability, we can see and understand our individual tipping points. So yes, we focus on our strengths, we push ourselves, but we also do this from a very grounded position that acknowledges vulnerability. Brené Brown is the big thinker in this space, who's very much reframed vulnerability away from that so, labeled weakness to something that actually incorporates a very different notion. In Brené Brown's eyes, vulnerability is the birthplace of creativity, innovation, and change. And to create is to make something that's never existed before. There's nothing more vulnerable than that. What's very interesting is that Brené is touching on this idea that by being unable to be fully independent, we then become more connected with others and have space for true collaboration and creativity. With this reality, we also see ourselves far more than just the I, and we begin to rely on others, which makes our non-reality and reality far closer, therefore reducing what the Buddha sort of termed as the long-term suffering. So this is very much an art, but it has been around for a while, as the Einstein quote reflects. So it's almost by saying that if we do think that we might be at risk of burnout, if we're continuing to do the same thing day out, day in, day out, by pushing ourselves through this resilience barrier, expect the same results. Nothing really changes. Whereas a lot of the academic movement now is beginning to challenge some of these aspects of resilience to try and incorporate, potentially through mindfulness, the idea that we are vulnerable, and therefore creating a new formula and ultimately a different set of results.
I'd just like to pose a question to the people on this webinar to ask themselves to what extent they allow themselves to be vulnerable, or indeed, if that's too hard, to think of people that they know who are so. People who perhaps are a little happier, feeling vulnerable and making a fool of themselves. People who really don't mind if they metaphorically trip up, and what sort of characters they are, and what sort of contributions they make to your life, whether that's in work or whether that's in the family or your friendship group. Because I think what's happening as a result of what Rachel's just been saying is there is a shift in our thinking about how individuals like that show up, and indeed how we might want to be a little bit more vulnerable in what we do. And I want to talk about a guy who wrote a book called Bounce. His name is Matthew Syed, S-Y-E-D. He is one of those amazing people who's not just been an extraordinary sports person in his case, but is also an excellent journalist and is an award-winning sports journalist. I recommend the book. This is one of the best books on talent and how talent can be grown and developed that you will read. He wrote with a forensic eye about performance. He took what many of us had already heard from Malcolm Gladwell and this 10,000 hours that you need of practice in order to get yourself into being excellent at something, world-class at something. He said, yes, but it needs to be far more intensive than that. And I'm going to give you just a tiny little example from the book of what he meant. Matthew Syed was, at the moment I'm telling you this story, our #1 table tennis player. He was number 24 in the world, but he had been UK #1 for a long period of time. That was not enough for him. He was interested in how he could get better. He noticed how many Chinese players were in the world's top 10, and he just happened to know that one of the people who was actually number 3 in the world had just retired from table tennis to leave his homeland and to come to the UK because he was marrying a British woman. He persuaded this guy to coach him. And eventually, after a lot of badgering, he did do that. And when he turned up, the Chinaman turned up for the first session in an estate car with a big piece of wood, a bucket, and a lot of balls. He put the piece of wood as an extension to the table tennis table that they were going to use, and then basically propelled a bucket of table tennis balls at incredible velocity towards Matthew Syed, who had been playing table tennis since he was able to see over the top of a table tennis table, and he was now #1 in the UK, probably in his 20s. And after 15 minutes of practice, Syed was flat on his back, exhausted. One of the things that he thought was, I have never practiced table tennis with more than one ball. There were many other thoughts he had, but that one I'm just going to hold with it. He was number 24 in the world, playing against number 3. There were 6 Chinese players in the top 10, and he had only ever practiced with one ball. So what is it that Rachel and I have been saying? It really is summed up when you look at the individual focus that we're bringing to this, that change is normal. We hear that all the time. Been hearing it for probably a decade or more, that change is now normality, the speed of which it's just getting faster and faster. Our expectations are shifting, as indeed are those of other people who we work with and who employ us. And we need to understand this, and we need to be smart in understanding the new status quos that we have to deal with. And I would suggest to you that one of the biggest issues is around adaptability and flexibility. How do we achieve those states of being adaptable? That is both in our heads and in our actions, because it actually hits on the things that you've heard Rachel say, particularly around mindsets, around fitness, around growth, and around the learning orientation.
Do you think that managers and leaders face different or the same challenges when it comes to resilience and vulnerability? Any thoughts?
I think at the level of the human impact, in other words, where you are feeling under the cosh, I think, yes, it is very similar. I think, though, that managers probably have a different type of pressure on them, because one of the reasons that you go up an organization in terms of the responsibility that you have and typically what your reward is for that responsibility, there is an expectation that you'll be able to handle more. So I think actually, although the challenges are going to be slightly different in that sense, I think the challenge also for the organization is what is the level of support that you give somebody that is stepping into supervision, managerial roles, or indeed as they go further and further in terms of their levels of accountability and responsibility, how you continue to support them. I actually think that's the really big issue. I think in terms of turning up for work, how much sleep you're getting or not getting, what your commute is like, what your hygiene factors around food and fitness are, they're probably relatively similar. And I was actually talking to a young manager this morning about this very issue, because the organization is in a bit of a pickle and it needs him to step up to the mark, but his challenge is that he is already feeling overloaded. So what we were discussing was, if you were to take this role, where do you believe you can make the biggest contribution to the organization, to the team that you may well be taking on, because they're going to expand his remit, and also to make sure that you are able to do it. And so it was a sort of a recontracting with himself initially before he steps into a conversation with senior colleagues around what is possible and what is not going to create an ill health problem for him downstream.
Do you think that it is acceptable to cry at work in a leadership position? I've always thought that perhaps this should be in private, but if we should show vulnerability, is it okay?
I think there's a couple of things I want to pick up on, and I think the first is the word should. I don't think what Simon and I are trying to portray is the idea of a should show your emotions. I think what we're trying to say is that we'd like to change the environment where it's acceptable, but it's still up to that individual as to what's authentic for them. I've been in some situations where my leader at the time, and also if I've been managing a team, I've witnessed tears around the table, and what that actually did was unlock a lot of emotion for other people and gave them permission to share. I think what we're trying to touch on is articulating yourself in a way that feels authentic. So that could be tears for some, but it could just be a very open dialogue for others. And trying to create a culture where that is supported is what we're trying to sort of talk through from a vulnerability perspective here.
I think when you listen to that, what you also have to think about is what the reaction needs to be to somebody who is feeling tearful, because it could be for lots of different reasons, and it's very easy for us to jump to our own conclusions about what those reasons are. And I think the important thing is to empathize and not to sympathize. So in other words, to come into that sort of common space, because somebody who is tearful and is crying is creating a new space, and you want to create common ground and a common conversation in that space. And it needs ideally to be a non-pejorative space as well. You'll remember at the beginning that Rachel said we were looking at three elements, and the second of those was to focus on the business context, and that's what I'm going to kick off with now. So the first one is about business contexts. Things have changed a huge amount. When I started work a long time back, ICI, Imperial Chemicals Industries, was the largest UK company by some distance, and one of the largest in the world at that time. It was huge, it was international, it was respected, it was a process industry. It was not a very pretty industry, actually. But then I thought further and thought, well, if you go back a little bit beyond that, the traditional UK economy was around primary stuff like mining, manufacturing, process industries. They were quite different cultures to the sort of more service-oriented cultures that we now have in business. They were also hierarchical, much more hierarchical than we have today. They were blue-collar. You may remember that term, white-collar, blue-collar. Blue-collar were the people on the shop floor who were using a lot more sweat and machinery to get things done than is typical today. The type of attitudes that management and leaders had in this particular culture, in this setup, is very different to today. where we have these days far less tiers throughout an organization, much more sort of matrix management. We have computing power. We have the ability to communicate in very different ways. Emails are only, 20 years old? Probably less than that. For most of us, that is just now the norm. So there are distinctions that can be made between the traditional view and the new way of things, and how that is impacting on us personally in our professional lives and the work boundaries. Because there was a time not very long ago when your work was at work, your data was at work. There was nothing you could do about it. You could think as you were washing up or mowing the lawn, but there wasn't much you could bring away with you. Today, as you've already heard, data and access to us is on us pretty much all the time. If we carry a smartphone or a laptop or whatever, we can be got at, and more importantly, we can see it if we wish to. So this speed, this intensity, this access to us has changed fundamentally, and we need to be okay with it. Because the other thing is that at the same time all this has been going on, the relationship that we have with our businesses and our work are more transient than ever before. No longer are we thinking, oh, we'll sign up here and stay with them forever. We will stay as employees for as long as we believe it's okay to, from our perspective, and then we will move on. And as I say at the bottom here, contracts are based far more on goodwill, or put another way, on intangibles like trust and honesty, and do I get on with this boss and this organization? Are they treating me okay? Much more than the tangibles of the past, which were reward probably being the most obvious of them. What does this actually mean then in terms of vulnerability and particularly organizational diversity? Organizational diversity is a really interesting concept because I think it's quite new. I think we've grown up in recent years with inclusion and diversity at the individual level and groups, but now we're talking about organizational diversity. You actually hear about companies and organizations looking to create a charter of organizational diversity, knowing that we cannot stand still. We have to deal with global competition, whether that's on price or service or quality, and things are changing fast. I read last week of the Fortune 500 companies of year 2000, over 50% of them have either merged, been acquired, or gone bankrupt. ICI was before that, but it doesn't matter how big you get now, anybody's fair game for competition and to be reduced to lower levels of performance and have to find their own pathways. So seeking improvement is a natural state, whether it's for an organization or for us personally, as is the idea of having independent thinkers. In politics today, more and more people come into representative roles with a more independent mind. They might come in under a particular color of flag or rosette, but when they get there, they're more independent-minded than maybe the generation that was there before them. If you take that into extremists with loads and loads of independent thinkers, you'll end up with getting absolutely nowhere because you'll never get agreement on what sort of legislation to pass. So there's sort of a balance between these things. And there's a nod to willful blindness, which is just independent thinking is so important because otherwise you have herd instinct, people thinking like sheep and just going on and thinking it's all okay, and nobody saying, well, hang on, the emperor hasn't got any clothes on. Where may we get with this if vulnerability and organizational diversity are becoming more important to our thinking? Well, there are a number of things. The first is we believe we're going to have better thinking in organizations because it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to have diverse thoughts. What that will bring us is more robust models, people who are expected to think harder and deeper than maybe some of us do. And that we value not just those things that we can measure, but those things which are intangible. And all of this, in our view, should lead to higher levels of productivity, which I'm sure you'll admit is a big issue.
From my research perspective, since around 2012, there's been a real question mark over the idea of resilience as a trait for leaders. And there's many publications that have been sort of called Drop Your Mask or Let's Reveal the Mask of a Leader, in particular by Peter Fuder. And I think what this is touching on is the idea that actually The trend has changed in the last couple of years, but the trend prior to that around leaders feeling this need to be seen to be resilient all the time is in fact not only unsustainable for that individual, and often, actually there's one article that came out about 3 months ago that said 35% of leaders feel fatigued by the very fact that they have to constantly wear this mask of resilience. And I guess that 35% is also only those that chose to be vulnerable and actually share how they were truly feeling. And that kind of cycle of the imposter syndrome is very exhausting. So you might feel that you have to play the tough guy, as the previous leader had done before, or then you tried that, it doesn't feel right, so you try the sensitive guy approach. And ultimately you end up with a who am I guy mask, and it can be very draining. Not just in the context of I. If you begin to challenge this mask process, you also begin to unravel the mirror effect of having a mask on those around you, in particular in your immediate team. And what this does is send ripple effects of very unrealistic expectations around A, what leadership behaviour is, and also B, how you should interact with that leader. And if we sort of take a cycle back to the slide around mindfulness, you're again creating a very broad V whereby your non-reality, i.e. who you can be on a daily basis, is very far, because of these masks, from the truth. I think what this ultimately is touching on is this new call, not only in academia, but also some sort of fairly advanced cultures, for authenticity. So rather than let's try and be resilient, or try and indeed be 100% vulnerable, let's try and be truly authentic or truthful. I think as I say these words, my shoulders drop, and it's almost like, what a relief. Like if I just had to bring myself to work, not the image of who I thought I should be, it just lifts your energy and also drops your shoulders. From this truthful space, we begin to learn how to be more open and direct with people, because you don't have to navigate around the politics or the different stories that people are projecting through their own confused masks. So you can therefore just be very respectfully honest and direct. We also begin to see our role in the wider system of an organisation, and how each of our behaviours, if we're very clean and authentic on a daily basis, we begin to create a cleaner system around us for the true collaboration which Simon was touching on before. And this collectively, sort of understanding of the I and also the we, helps to create greater productivity for the organisation as a whole. What it also does, so for those high achievers that are very much in the resilience bucket, it helps push them in a sustainable fashion because they're ultimately more present by having less energy directed towards the masks. But also for those that are vulnerable, and we've begun to touch on areas of mental health, and we know that 1 in 4 do actually, that's probably the best case scenario. There's different figures that suggest it could be 2 in 4 do suffer from mental health, where if you're feeling very stressed, anxious or depressed, the idea of being resilient is so different from your reality. If we touch on this collaborative, almost communal form that actually it's okay that you're feeling low today, but let's work as a team and get through it, you naturally begin to bring them up as well, and not only rectify presenteeism, but also help create better, more sustainable absenteeism rates. So I think collectively the idea is then that readdressing vulnerability and resilience creates the seedbed for a more sustainable view on well-being.
Leadership itself and being a leader in the past, and I think we're only talking like a little while ago, it's a matter of months and years, not decades, has and is changing. And what leadership needs to be, could be and needs to be, has to change because of the things that we've talked about in terms of the acceleration of change in the workplace, and particularly to do with the new generations that are in the workplace now and are coming, and the demands and expectations that they have. One of the big issues, I think, that leadership is having to grapple with, and particularly in the public forum, for those who are leading in the public place, is the internet and the transparency that that is actually giving individuals, because we have far greater access to find out stuff, but also to ask why. Why are you doing that? Why is that your decision? What is it that led you to believe that was a good idea? And right at the moment, there's some criticism about the number of U-turns that are being made by those in public office. I think it's got something to do with this. We have an expectation of our leadership, wherever we are, that there is going to be greater meaning in work and in organizational work because we want it. It's something that has been sort of almost in the margins for as long as work has been work. And now we have greater expectations, all of us, of any generation. And we think there are 4 generations working, and I think everybody feels like that. But the aspirations of younger people are really interesting because the evidence is that when they look around them, they seek respect, respect in the way that you heard Rachel define around authenticity and authentic behavior. And I guess they're not seeing it, are they, Rachel, to the same degree?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. It's interesting because I think some of the research that I did at a global management consultancy, we were talking about what are your values and belief system as to why you joined an organisation as a graduate. And then sort of 2 or 18 months to 24 months down the line, what is the key value of that organisation that encourages you to stay or not? And it's probably not a surprise that the top reason why a young graduate would join an organisation such as a management consultancy house is financial. It's the remuneration, that obvious trait. But actually 12, 18 and in particular 24 months down the line, the number one reason was their ability to manage their own well-being. So whether this be due to feeling authentic themselves in the work context or also being supported by people who had that wellness, I guess, kind of core competency or ability to support that in other people was the sole reason that they decided to stay or leave. And that was a huge shift. So it's not just simply around how do we support them, but it's also how do we reward their new belief system.
Understanding what it is that people want from work, their relationship with work, is not something that we just play lip service to. We really do have to understand it. And why, you ask, is social entrepreneurship so popular? It's because of the meaning and the purpose. Yes, it's a great way to earn a living, but it's really about the supportive cultures that emerge when you're doing things with a common purpose that really has meanings for people. And this is what underlines the relationship with work and what we sometimes call engagement these days. But it's also about our own well-being. And I want to give you an example of this. This is a quick case study before we go into another question and answer session about a new manager only took over a role about 8 months ago where we called it a win-win-win-win because it has been really successful from the individual's point of view, from the manager's point of view, from the team's perspective and from the organization. This individual took up the role of manager, never having been involved before. But what they actually chose to do was to try and be a coaching manager. That's what they said they wanted to be when we were saying to them, well, what do you mean by that? And why do you think that would be a good philosophy for whatever it is you step in to do? Actually, what it was about the things that Rachel was talking about earlier. It was about speaking to every individual and giving them time and space for them to let it all out. These people had worked in the organization for quite some time. They had their own views. They had their own aspirations. Their energies in some cases were really low, and they were ripe for being picked up by somebody that sought to understand them before telling them anything about what it was that they were going to do. In a great book on the new art of leadership, they talk about social identity and the importance of leaders and managers understanding the group before they set the template for that group and its activities. And that's exactly what this guy did. Listened hard and then gained the commitment of the team so that over the weeks and months that followed, from him starting this role in September, the throughput, the productivity of the group went up. Even when his back was turned because he might have been out on the road, the team was now a team, not a group of individuals. They were talking to each other about the work that was coming in and allocating it between themselves. This was unheard of, and the results have been extraordinary in terms of the engagement of these individuals and the view they have of their work, of their manager, and of the organization that has employed them.
How would you advise people who work in a culture in which it is uncomfortable to be vulnerable?
For me, it's very much about really understanding why I feel the need to be vulnerable first. And once I was confident in that, it's then coming back to the idea of authenticity. and saying, actually, no, I think it's appropriate to share these emotions. And even I kind of did a bit of reading around it to validate that actually this sort of letting go enables me to move forward, and therefore the overall impact on productivity is better. But so once I was confident in myself, I then felt able to communicate that to a person that would ultimately meet me halfway. And as Simon has touched on before, it's about creating a space for empathy. And I think you can be very intuitive as to who would be an appropriate person to first start creating that kind of culture with. And then from that conversation, just keep consistent, and hopefully those wider sort of vulnerable traits will spread amongst the team.
It comes down to personal confidence quite a bit. And I have to acknowledge that one's personal confidence can be diluted by the culture that you work in over time. But if you do have the confidence, and I'm suggesting to you the confidence that comes from the value that you have, the value that when you turn up to work, people actually are paying you to do something because they value your input. If you have that and you really extrapolate that thought, what is the worst that can happen by you choosing to be more vulnerable? What is the worst that can happen? What are they going to do to you? So I think it's worthwhile thinking a little bit harder about it and thinking just where your place is in this particular dynamic. And you may well conclude, we find with the what clients we work with, that they conclude that they have a lot more power and influence in a situation than they normally have credited themselves with until they've thought about it.
That last question really feeds nicely into this next slide around shifting perceptions. So we're kind of moving on to that third element of the conversation today about how do you take something practical away from it. And ultimately, we're trying to articulate today is this idea of a more humanistic approach. You know, from a heart perspective, we're all probably thinking, yes, it sounds great, but then tomorrow when I go and sit at my desk at 9 o'clock with my coffee, how can I be different? We've touched on it very briefly, but it comes down to a two-step approach. The first of which is really understanding your own perception of yourself and recognizing that you can have good and bad days and learning to be okay with that. Because it's very interesting, if you're having a bad day, the peripheral narrative around that bad day exacerbates the negativity of it and ultimately limits you even further. Because if we learn as a human, we have a rhythm, ups and downs, and on balance, we're constantly moving forward, and we accept that, then actually this is a very powerful mechanism from which to grow from. The second part of that, so once you've found the acceptance, is then learning to articulate it in a mindful fashion that isn't deemed as either playing victim or also particularly aggressive and saying, today I am not productive and I am having a bad day, so therefore I'm not going to do anything. So it's being mindful about how you, in a very compassionate and sensitive way, can articulate your own humanistic vulnerabilities. But there's also an art to doing that constructively. And I think the next slide, I'm very happy to share a sort of personal story on this. And I'm by no means sort of got it mastered, but I think practice does help. And actually about sort of 2 years ago, I was unfortunately knocked over by a drink driver while cycling home. It was quite a severe number of injuries that came out of this. And what was perfectly timed from my perspective, I was in the depths of doing a lot of research around this for my master's. So I first, from a psychological perspective, wanted to understand, who really survives these things and who makes the most rapid progress. And what was particularly, I guess, shocking from my perspective is that the population that struggled to really create a healthy recovery through something such as a significant trauma was a demographic who were high achievers. There's the high achievers who were ultimately relying on independence previously, had very high expectations of themselves, and were outwardly successful. And the reason that they struggled to make a significant and sustainable recovery was partly because they didn't know how to be vulnerable. They struggled to ask for help, and they struggled to really accept where they were at life. I think from that I had a bit of a reality check, and I wanted to really dive a little bit deeper by holding a mirror onto myself and sort of saying, how, if I am, which I probably was, that kind of high achiever bucket person, begin to actually learn to accept where I was. And that be physically, emotionally, from a career perspective, all of these things. But ultimately, by sitting down, and for me that was through mindfulness, meditation, some gentle yoga, and properly acknowledging what had happened, I began to let it go. And I think through the forums that I have shared, whether it be through the rehab gym, you notice people who are actually stuck in their story. And this really limits them, and it doesn't have to be a traumatic crash accident or whatever. It can be very simple things. But this art of self-reflection, letting go, is a very healthy way of being vulnerable to then move forward. And what it gave me was this concept that we touched on around confidence. I was very real with myself that actually I was looking to come back 3 days a week for 6 months to have a return phase, because I felt physically that was what I was able to do, but also that was a stretch for me, so something I could grow into to find another layer of resilience before hopefully going up to full time. And what was interesting was that my old mindset was like, you can't possibly go and ask for a 3-day-a-week concept. This is just unheard of, especially as an independent consultant. But actually, if you articulate it in a non-victim, very constructive manner and say, this is the reasons why it worked for me, and that actually 3 days a week, I will guarantee I'll be 100% present and with you and able to add value. It was a bit of a shock because without any contest, the answer at the other end of the client's table was absolutely, as if it was only my story around the concept that was actually holding me back before. So for me, this art of self-reflection, self-understanding and acceptance, and then being vulnerable enough to sort of say, actually, my new norm is this. The kind of negative energy around that was in the majority held by myself. And actually, often people meet you halfway and surprise you with their reflection or their reaction to what you're going through.
This is much, much shorter, but it's a very interesting little case study of an entrepreneur who still working, but probably at a stage of life where they don't need to anymore, both because of the wealth they've generated and the stage of life they're at. And I remember introducing this chap when he was going to give a talk one day and talked about the 3 fabulous entrepreneurial projects that he had been involved in and how successful they were, etc., etc. Everything went well, and later on he came and had a quiet word in my ear and he said, you know, if ever there's a time when you introduce me again, could you please say that I've been involved in 5 entrepreneurial projects and 2 of them failed? So I looked at him and he said, no, I'm serious. If anything, I'd rather talk about the failures than the successes because I learned more in those that enabled me to be successful. And I was also reading a guy who's a serial entrepreneur and who writes in one of the big Sunday broadsheets here in the UK, and he says exactly the same thing, that business is a challenge for us all day, every day, and those who choose to put themselves into the place that entrepreneurs do are going to have the rough with the smooth. And please don't airbrush the failures, because you do need to talk about the things which went wrong and critically to learn from them. The importance of understanding yourself, that perception of yourself, and how it is that you want to challenge yourself, to stretch yourself, to recognize that in coaching, as we say, that you are resourceful and you are creative. You're a whole person. You have far more to give than even you probably understand. So go there and try it. And work with other people. Part of stretching yourself and stretching your thinking is to work with people who challenge you. And they will change the paradigms in your own head. Another of those lovely quotes about that Einstein said was about, you know, the brain once moved will never return to the same position. Put yourself into those positions where even though you may not like it and you may not like the person or the people that you're with, they will challenge your thinking and you will come through it and be in a better place as a result. Then there's a chance to explore your options. Think about it. As Rachel said a moment ago, it didn't occur to her, it sounded as if it would be that easy for somebody to say, yes, Rachel, we'd love that. That would be great for you to work 3 days. We quite often put our own barriers before we even explore or indeed experiment and look for options for action. And when we go through these steps, how clear we are about what it is that we're going to go and do next. If any of you are involved in coaching as coachees or as coaches, you will know that it's all about being clear, and then the action seems to take care of itself. When you've thought it through, you know exactly what steps you take and in what order. So in summary, we said that we wanted to focus on the individual and then on the business context, and to give you some useful and practical tips. We hope that's what we've done. I want to leave you with just a tiny quote from the end of a book I've just finished by Atul Gawande called Being Mortal. He is a surgeon as well as a speaker and a writer, amazing man, and he's written this book on what it's like to deal with being a medical professional, helping people get fixed at whatever stage of life they're at, but particularly at the end of their lives, and what it is that needs to be done to take life to the point where then you pass on. And he says, we've been wrong about what our job is in medicine. We think our job is to ensure health and survival, but really it's larger than that. It is to enable well-being. And well-being is about the reasons one wishes to be alive. Our view in this webinar is to look at the subjects of resilience and of vulnerability and embrace them as leaders as we move into the future.
So this member of the audience believes that it's not always the case that leaders need to agree about the relevant levels of adaptability within the organisation. They say that yes, we all need to be adaptable, but don't we also need a clear structure and certainty to ensure that we're all doing the right things at the right time in the right way? So how can we balance and strike at that right level of adaptability in the organisation?
What I notice is that organizational development has never been so important and valuable in organizations as it is today. It's always been important, but the speed of change is making it more and more important that organizations adjust their structures in order to create the certainty that's been implicit in this question. I absolutely agree that you do not have to agree with everything. That's leaders and managers get paid to take a position for the benefit of their organization. That's their officers, after all, of the organization and of their stakeholders. Creating structure is important because people do need some form of structure and boundaries in which to work effectively. And in worlds of uncertainty, you have to be conscious that you're going to need to change your structures. People are going to come, people are going to go, you're going to have fluidity in your and flexibility in your labor, that maybe you had certainty that there was somebody who was a full-time professional working for you, now you don't. You buy it in when you need it, by the project. Whatever it may be that creates the change, you have to be adaptable. So I completely agree with what you're suggesting, that there is a balance between structure and certainty on the one hand and how you deal with uncertainty in an appropriate way. I would just end by saying that leaders, and quite often HR are with them, see change in structure, organizational structure, earlier than others do. And it's only fair that people are treated with respect when change comes and impacts on them.
Just a few things here. From a neuroscience perspective, we need both, I guess, control and non-control. So the idea of rigid things such as a routine, but also the reality of change. And I think just from a personal experience, that's sort of like a dance. And knowing that you can be on that one extreme or the other and being at peace with where you're at. Because I guess a lot of coaching that I witness is that people often averse to change and therefore try and grab on to control and certainty. But it's learning to hold on to it without a very, very tight grip and saying, I know you're there, and maybe tomorrow there might be a rebalance. And sort of creating this dance between the two is, I think, the way that we're trying to go with this sort of position of vulnerability and resilience.
What is, in your opinion, the best way to obtain a good result and to maintain our leadership from your experiences? So what can you do as a leader to be the best that we can be?
Again, I think this is a hugely personal response, but it's about knowing the self. So from a practical perspective, I know that to enable me to show up every morning, I have a rigid routine of yoga and meditation. And that calms my senses, it makes me very clear about what I want to achieve in the day, but it also means that when I arrive at my desk, my stories are left behind, and I feel that I try my best to come to the table very clear with my intentions and clear as to who I am and want to be that day. And I think from there is a very healthy ripple effect. So for me, it's all about the morning start, setting your intention and then being clear and communicating that with the people that you work with.
I think that listening to what you heard Rachel say a moment ago about being authentic, being happy to be you and not worrying too much about the little things. Part of that authenticity is that you do what you say you will do. I think that's really important. I think another one, which is really fundamental, and it goes back to the independent thinking we were talking about a little while ago, is having the courage to ask a question when you're not clear about what's going on. Because what I've noticed in my career is when that happens, it's amazing how many other people around the table or in the meeting, if it's a bigger meeting, wish they had asked the same question. It's part of that sort of groupthink willful blindness thing that people don't ask the obvious question. Just say, what do you mean by that? Could you explain what that is? And it brings the meeting or brings the subject matter down to some real basic things that everybody can understand. Next thing I would say is time your meetings to suit you and suit what you're trying to do. So for example, I've always found having group sessions where you're trying to be involved in quite an intelligent debate, maybe a creative, innovative type discussion, do it before lunch, not in the graveyard session and after lunch. Pick your moment. Know when you've got high energy and others around you have as well. Final thing, and this is really crucial and underpins the case study a moment ago, which is giving time for individuals. When you give time as a leader to an individual one-on-one, nothing should get in the way of that, other than if there's a fire or one of you's ill or a person who's critically important to you, like a spouse or a partner or a child, should get you out of that. It should be that sort of intense in terms of creating private time to do your work. That will pay off. It will not just pay off whilst you're leading that individual. It will be the reason that they stay with you, reason why you have a good relationship with them for as long as you live.
I think we've come to the end of the session now. So thank you for joining us and for your various questions. If you'd like to connect with Rachel or Simon, then please do feel free to drop them an email. They'll be happy to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us and see you next time.